Right now, in a handful of small American towns, foreign companies are pouring tens of billions of dollars into factories, not because of market demand, but because of a single tax clause buried inside a climate bill. And that clause has triggered something officials in Europe and Asia are now openly calling an economic attack from an ally. The bill is the Inflation Reduction Act. In 2022, it was sold to the public as a climate law. 3 years later, it looks more like the largest industrial relocation event in modern American history, and the fallout is reshaping global supply chains, mineral markets, and alliances in real time. Here's the part most people miss. The IRA wasn't really designed to reduce emissions as its primary function. It was designed to rebuild American manufacturing capacity, using climate technology as the vehicle, and in doing so, it turned clean energy into the new front line of global industrial competition. Allies felt blindsided. Supply chains got rerouted overnight, and countries that control raw materials suddenly found themselves holding geopolitical leverage they didn't have 5 years ago. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the IRA isn't just an energy policy anymore. It's a tool of economic statecraft, and the rest of the world is now responding in kind. Let's start with why this hits America differently than almost any other country. For decades, the story of American manufacturing has been one of decline. Factory towns across the Midwest and Rust Belt watched production move overseas, first to Mexico, then increasingly to China and Southeast Asia. By the early 2020s, the United States found itself in an uncomfortable position. It was the world's largest consumer of solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles, but it manufactured almost none of the components that went into them. Solar cells came from China. Battery cells came from China, South Korea, and Japan. The critical minerals that go into those batteries, lithium, cobalt, graphite, nickel, were processed almost entirely outside U.S. borders, much of it in China. The IRA changed the financial logic of that arrangement. Instead of just funding clean energy adoption, it built in conditional subsidies, tax credits that only pay out if production happens domestically, or with materials sourced from trusted trade partners. This is the part that matters. It wasn't a blank check. It was a tax credit structure engineered to physically pull supply chains back onto U.S. soil, or at least onto the soil of countries Washington considers allies. For the average viewer, here's why this matters beyond the climate angle. These factories are landing in specific places: Georgia, Tennessee, Michigan, the Carolinas, Arizona. Many of these are politically significant regions, often represented by lawmakers who would never describe themselves as climate champions. That's not an accident. The IRA was structured so that the economic benefits, jobs, tax revenue, construction booms, would be felt in places that historically lost the most from globalization. Whatever your view on the politics, the practical result is the same. For the first time in 50 years, America is seeing a wave of new industrial construction tied directly to where things are physically made, not just where they're consumed. Now let's get into the mechanics, because this is where the IRA gets genuinely clever as a piece of industrial policy. The centerpiece is something called the 45X Advanced Manufacturing Production Credit. Here's the key distinction. This isn't a one-time grant for building a factory. It's a production credit, meaning the government pays manufacturers a set amount for every battery cell, every solar module, every unit of processed critical mineral they actually produce, on an ongoing basis. That's a fundamentally different incentive than a construction subsidy. It rewards continuous output, which means companies are incentivized to keep production lines running at full capacity for years, not just build a facility and hope for the best. Then there's the 30D Consumer EV Tax Credit, which comes with rules that have quietly reshaped global battery supply chains. To qualify, vehicles can't contain battery components or critical minerals from what the law calls a foreign entity of concern, language that, in practice, targets Chinese-linked supply chains. This single clause forced automakers and battery manufacturers to go back and redesign sourcing strategies for materials they'd relied on for over a decade. Suddenly, a battery that was perfectly fine to sell in 2021 might not qualify for consumer incentives in 2026 unless its lithium, graphite, or processing steps could be traced away from Chinese ownership. And then there's 48C, which funds the retooling of existing industrial facilities. Think of an old internal combustion engine plant being converted into an EV battery assembly line. This matters because it's often cheaper and faster to retrofit existing industrial infrastructure than to build greenfield sites from scratch, and 48C specifically targets that pathway. To understand how powerful this gets, Walk through the journey of a single lithium-ion battery cell. It starts with raw materials: lithium from a mine, possibly in Australia or Chile; graphite, often processed in China; cobalt, frequently sourced from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Those materials get refined and processed into battery-grade chemicals. Then they're combined into electrode materials, assembled into cells, and packed into modules that go into a vehicle or a grid storage system. Under the IRA, nearly every one of those stages now has a financial incentive attached to it, if it happens domestically or in a country with a free trade agreement with the US. And here's the critical part. These credits stack. A company can claim 45x for producing the cells, additional credits for processing certain minerals domestically, and pass-through benefits via 30D for the finished vehicle. When you add all of that up, US-based battery production, which was simply not cost-competitive with China for nearly 2 decades, suddenly starts looking financially viable, sometimes even advantageous for the first time. The result has been a surge in announced battery manufacturing capacity in the US that, just a few years ago, industry analysts would have called unrealistic. But announcing factories and triggering a geopolitical conflict turned out to be the same thing. America's allies didn't see this coming, at least not at this scale, and many felt blindsided by the protectionist core hiding inside what was marketed globally as a climate bill. Start with Europe. The European Union has its own ambitions to build a domestic battery and EV manufacturing base, partly to reduce dependence on Asia, but European officials quickly realized that IRA credits were often more generous, faster to access, and less bureaucratically complicated than equivalent European incentives. For a battery manufacturer deciding where to build a new gigafactory, Germany, Poland, or Georgia, the IRA tilted that calculation. European leaders began openly describing the bill as an existential threat to European industrial competitiveness, language usually reserved for actual trade disputes, not climate legislation from an ally. South Korea and Japan present an even more complicated picture. These countries are home to some of the world's most advanced battery manufacturers. Companies like LG Energy Solution, Samsung SDI, SK On, and Panasonic. These firms have every incentive to build plants in the US to capture IRA credits and access the American EV market. But their home governments have the opposite incentive. They want to preserve manufacturing jobs and industrial capacity domestically. So you end up with a strange dynamic: Korean and Japanese companies investing tens of billions of dollars into American factories, while officials in Seoul and Tokyo quietly worry about a slow-motion hollowing out of their own battery sectors. Then there's China, still the dominant player in raw material processing, especially for graphite and rare earth elements, even as it's increasingly locked out of the US consumer credit system. The foreign entity of concern rules created an immediate scramble. Automakers and battery makers needed to find graphite, lithium processing, and rare earth supplies that weren't tied to Chinese entities. That's much harder than it sounds, because China didn't just happen to dominate these markets. It built that dominance deliberately over 20 years, and alternative processing capacity in other countries is limited and expensive to scale. Europe's response has been to loosen its own state aid rules dramatically, allowing member states to offer subsidies that would have been illegal under EU competition law just a few years earlier, essentially racing to match what the US is offering. Officials on both sides of the Atlantic have started using a phrase that would have been unthinkable in a climate policy context not long ago: subsidy race. This is the moment where green industrial policy stopped pretending to be just about emissions and openly became what it functionally always was: a contest for manufacturing capacity, jobs, and strategic supply chain control. Zoom out further, and you start to see how this connects to the much larger geopolitical realignment already underway around critical minerals and supply chain security. The IRA accelerated something that was already happening more slowly: the broader effort by Western economies to de-risk their supply chains away from dependence on China. But the IRA poured an enormous amount of capital into that effort, on a much faster timeline than anyone expected. Here's the problem the US ran into almost immediately. It simply does not have enough domestic lithium, cobalt, graphite, or rare earth processing capacity to satisfy its own manufacturing ambitions. So the practical effect of the IRA's domestic content rules has been to force the creation of a new alliance structure. Countries with free trade agreements with the US, or countries willing to negotiate critical mineral partnerships, suddenly became strategically important in a way they weren't before. This is creating a new kind of mineral geopolitics. Countries like Australia, Chile, Indonesia, and Canada Places with significant lithium, copper, nickel, or cobalt reserves now find themselves in a stronger negotiating position with Washington than at almost any point in recent history. Indonesia, which controls a massive share of global nickel reserves, has been leveraging that position to demand more domestic processing and higher value manufacturing happen on its own soil rather than simply exporting raw ore. Resource-rich countries are starting to behave less like passive suppliers and more like strategic players with actual cards to play. China, for its part, hasn't sat still. In response to Western de-risking efforts, Beijing has placed export restrictions on materials like gallium, germanium, and certain graphite processing technologies, materials critical to semiconductors, batteries, and defense applications. This is a tit-for-tat dynamic. The West restricts access to its consumer markets and subsidies for Chinese-linked supply chains, and China restricts access to materials and processing technology the West depends on. Neither side is doing this purely out of climate concern. Both sides understand exactly what's at stake, and this is where it connects back to the broader theme of energy security. Domestic battery and solar manufacturing isn't just about creating jobs. It's about ensuring that as the U.S. builds out its electrical grid, expands storage capacity, and electrifies transportation, it isn't doing so while remaining dependent on a geopolitical rival for the core components that make that transition possible. Batteries, in particular, are dual-use technology. The same manufacturing base that produces EV batteries can produce batteries for military applications and grid-scale storage that underpins national infrastructure resilience. Whoever controls battery and solar manufacturing capacity in the coming decades controls a lever of power that's increasingly comparable to oil in the 20th century. Now, before this starts to sound like a guaranteed American industrial renaissance, it's worth pausing on the nuance. Because the gap between announced investment and actual operating factories is significant. A large number of the battery and solar projects announced since 2022 have faced delays, scaled-back timelines, or outright cancellations. Some of this is tied to slower-than-expected EV demand growth in the U.S. market, which has made some manufacturers hesitant to bring planned capacity fully online. Announced investment figures make for great headlines, but they're not the same as operational factories producing at scale. There's also a cost reality that doesn't go away just because of subsidies. Even with credits stacked on top of each other, domestic manufacturing in many cases remains more expensive than importing from China. The IRA credits function more like a bridge, narrowing the cost gap enough to make domestic production viable, rather than a permanent fix to underlying cost structures. And because these are tax credits embedded in legislation, their long-term political durability isn't guaranteed. Future administrations and future Congresses could modify, expand, or roll back these provisions, which creates real uncertainty for companies trying to plan decade-long investments. There's also a less discussed bottleneck: labor. Building battery gigafactories and solar manufacturing lines requires a skilled workforce. Electricians, technicians, process engineers, and many of the regions receiving this investment don't currently have that workforce at the scale needed. Training pipelines take years to build, and this gap is arguably a bigger constraint on the pace of reshoring than financing has been. And finally, it's worth acknowledging that allied frustration is legitimate on both sides of this debate. The American argument is straightforward. National security justifies some degree of protectionism, especially for technologies tied to energy infrastructure and defense supply chains. The Allied counter-argument is also reasonable. At a moment when Western economies need a coordinated response to China's industrial dominance, the IRA instead created competition between allies, potentially weakening the broader coalition at exactly the moment unity mattered most. Neither side is simply wrong here. These are genuinely competing priorities, and how they get resolved will shape industrial policy for years. So what's the real legacy of the IRA? It proved definitively that climate policy and industrial geopolitical strategy are no longer separate categories. Every major economy designing energy policy from this point forward will do so with this lesson fully absorbed. Subsidies for clean technology are also subsidies for manufacturing dominance, supply chain control, and strategic leverage. That genie doesn't go back in the bottle. This isn't really a story about batteries or solar panels. It's a preview of how energy transition technology becomes the new terrain for economic and military competition, the same role oil played for most of the last century. The question now isn't whether other countries will respond with their own versions of this strategy. They already are. The real question is whether that response leads to a more diversified, resilient global supply chain, or to a more fragmented, expensive, and conflict-prone energy system where every major power is racing to control the inputs the next century runs on.